Paul is still on his first journey, and despite the fact that it sounds like it's going well, it's really not going that well. Let's just do this. Here's Greece, and then you come over here. Here's Asia Minor, or what we call modern-day Turkey. And then it goes on down this way. Jerusalem would be over here somewhere. And Jerusalem would be there. Antioch, there's two Antiochs actually. There's one up here in the Phoenician area, and there's another one over here in the Turkey area. This is the one that the Bible is mentioning here when Paul's in Antioch and he sails to Cyprus, which is a little island over here, or Salamis or whatever. He sails here, his first journey, and then he sails over here, and then he sails up here. And these are the cities that he begins to visit, and other one, Iconium over there, and Derbe. And he's bombing around all these, and then he'll go back actually, and then he'll finally sail back to Antioch, and that'll be the end of his first journey. So he's in this area right now. Ephesus eventually would be one of his main churches, and that would be over here on the coast. But right now he's doing all these. It's a very mountainous region, very tough region if you go there even to this day. Somewhat semi-desertous, a lot of rocky mountains, kind of like our Rocky Mountains. Our Appalachian Mountains are, all trees and national parks and beautiful and lovely. But these are not quite that. They are more rocky, like the Rockies. If you go out to the Sierra Nevadas, where they're big old giant rocky mountains. That's why they call them that. They're not covered in trees. They're not covered with waterfalls and all this stuff. It's more desertous, but there's mountains there. So, all right, that's where he is. We've left the island in the last chapter, and he's up here now. Okay, chapter 14. Let's look at it. Now it came about in Iconium that they entered the synagogue of the Jews together. And they spoke in a manner that a great multitude believed, both Jews and Greeks. But the Jews who disbelieved stirred up the minds of the Gentiles and embittered them against the brethren. Therefore they spent a long time there, speaking boldly, with reliance upon the Lord, who was bearing witness to the word of his grace, granting great signs and wonders done by their hands. But the multitude of the city was divided, and some sided with the Jews and some with the apostles. And when an attempt was made by both the Gentiles and the Jews with their rulers to mistreat and stone them, they became aware of it, and they fled to the cities of Laodicea, Lystra, and Derbe, the surrounding regions. That's these other little villages up here. They were here, and they ran for their lives, basically, because we were going to stone them to death, kill them. Now at Lystra, there was sitting a certain man without strength in his feet, lame from his mother's womb, and who had never walked. And the man was listening to Paul as he spoke, and when he had fixed his gaze upon him, he had seen that he had faith to be made well, and said with a loud voice, "Stand upright upon your feet." And suddenly he leapt up and began to walk. And when the multitude saw what Paul had done, they raised their voices in the Lycaonian language. "Behold, the gods have become like men and have come down to us." And they began calling Barnabas Zeus, and they called Paul Hermes, because he was their chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, and whose temple was just outside the city, brought oxen and garland to the gates and wanted to offer the sacrifice with the crowds. But when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their robes and rushed out of the crowds, crying out and saying, "Men, why are you doing these things?" We are also men of the same nature as you, and we preach the gospel to you in order that you should turn from these vain things to a living God, who made all the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. Now in the generations gone by, he permitted all the nations to go their own ways, and he did not leave himself without witnesses, that in that he did good and gave to you your rains from heaven in the fruitful season, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. And even saying these things, they with difficulty restrain the crowds from continuing to offer sacrifices to them. But Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having won over the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. And while the disciples stood around, Paul arose and entered again the city the next day. He went away with Barnabas to the city of Derbe. Now, after they had preached the gospel to that city and had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra and to Iconium and finally to Antioch, strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith, saying that through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. And when they had appointed elders for them in every church, having prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord in whom they had believed. And they passed through Pisidia and came to Pamphylia. And when they had spoken the word in Perga, they went down to Attalia. And from there they sailed and returned to Antioch, from which they had been commended by the grace of God for the work that they had accomplished, and began to report all the things that God had done with them, and how he opened the door to faith amongst the Gentiles, and spent a long time with his disciples. Okay, so this is the end of the first journey. Went down here, went up here, got in all kinds of trouble. They stoned him, tried to kill him. And then eventually they got back to Antioch, where they started from, where Barnabas found them in the first place and said, God has need of you. Hold that thought. We're going to come back and look at how God has need of him. I got to get my Bustelo. Oh man, I need a Bustelo. Cafe Bustelo. Last time I had a Bustelo, I can't remember. Oh, it was last Sunday. Never underestimate a Bustelo.
At least the top green.
What's that?
At least the top green.
It ain't green. Oh, I had a big... That's another story. Never mind. Every day of my life, Carol threatens me with life. You can't eat that. Why? Because that'll kill you. I'm trying to keep you alive. Eat this. Threatening me with life. I want the burger. You can't have the burger. But I want the burger. Anyway, that's...
Do veggie burgers.
Huh?
Do a veggie burger.
A veggie burger.
I saw them made and they have like that block like thing when you...
That's like decaf coffee. What is the point?
No point.
What is the point? If I'm going to eat something, let it be wonderful. What do you think of this chapter? Sadly, you all missed our discussion before you came in. Shirley and I were talking about it. Paul does a lot of suffering here, and probably the worst of the suffering, he gets stoned with rocks, and they dragged him out of the city, which is interesting. By covenantal law, if you go back to Leviticus, you're supposed to take them outside of the city and stone them. You don't stone them in the city. But I guess this just couldn't wait, so they stoned Paul in the city and then dragged him out and probably left his body in a hole somewhere. Question, was Paul dead? That's Shirley's question, I believe. And that's a good question. Was he dead and God resurrected him? Or was he just kind of maybe knocked unconscious, and with all the other rocks that hit him, he was probably pretty bloody, and they just thought he was dead and left him? Personally, I don't think it makes a difference.
Probably not.
in the sense that if somebody's hitting you with rocks, that's probably not a good thing, you know? And you're going to get hurt, and you're going to get hurt badly. And they didn't throw them like, oh, okay, boom. Wasn't like that. These guys were, you know, they were heaving rocks at you for the purpose of doing damage, and preferably, a lot of times they'd make games of it to see who would throw the killing rock, the one who would actually put it into you. I don't think Paul was dead. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. But I do think he was probably severely injured and beat up, and not maybe even mercifully in God's grace, knocked out. So he didn't feel as many other rocks. Once he was down, the guys probably said, well, he looks dead to me. And then they dragged him out of the city and threw him in a hole somewhere.
But verse 20 says,
Yeah. Verse 20.
they were just standing around him, and he stood up and...
Well, now they may have believed he was dead. And they were standing around going, now what are we going to do?
Yeah, but he must have been wounded terribly.
He probably was.
Ready to go.
But if they were standing around, that makes me believe that he was either unconscious, knocked out, or he was really dead. Maybe they got down there and looked down and said, man, this guy ain't breathing, ain't doing nothing. They thought, well, now Paul's dead, what are we going to do? Here we are a zillion miles from where we live, amongst a people we don't know, languages we don't know, and a whole bunch of folks that are real angry at us right now. And could it be we're next? You know, the disciples hid in the upper room for a number of times after Christ was crucified, with good reason, because in their minds they thought, we're next. Once they kill Christ, take out the head, then they'll come after the disciples. So they hid. Only John went to the cross. Remember that? The other guys were all hidden. Only the women went to the cross because everybody else was hidden. They ran off saying, we don't want to be next. See, this is really a judge of true faith when you get right down to it. I remember, and I've told some of you this story before, when Carol and I were young and in love, falling in love, we had a good friend whose name was Bobby, and I'll just stop there. I don't want to say his last name, but because it's being taped. But Bobby was a young man whose parents had died, and he had inherited their business, which was orange groves. And he had 2 or 3 huge orange groves around this area, closer actually, more over toward Lakeland than here. But he had 3 giant orange groves, and Carol and I were falling in love, and we were getting ready to get married. And he was also on the side, he was a photographer. And to this day, he took the one picture of our wedding, and we did it outside on the golf course over in Arrow Estates, because the church wanted $1,000, and we didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. So the golf course said you can have it for $100. But you have to have your little punch and cookies in the, whatever you call it, the golf house. Country club house or whatever you call it.
Punch and cookies.
Huh?
What is punch and cookies?
It's punch, you know, fruit punch and cookies.
It's a drink.
You couldn't have any alcohol. You had to have punch and cookies.
Okay.
Ponchito and cookitos.
Like reception. Yes, right. Okay.
Reception. Gotta roll that R. Reception. That's what the old nuns used to teach me. And I actually took Spanish. Did no good whatsoever. I did better in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin than I ever did with the Racha language. I just couldn't handle that. And just put an OES on everything male and an AES on everything female. That's what I know. Muchacha, muchacho.
Yeah.
That's all I learned. All right, anyway, where was I? Oh, orange groves. And I had at this time been considering the ministry. God had certainly talked to me, and I was ready to go, and I had preached a few times. at the home church, not in Antioch, in Eustis. And same thing. And Bobby Stokes was there. Anyway, the bottom line is I think he had visions of himself marrying Carol. And they would have an orange kingdom together. And this was all great and good until I showed up. So we had kind of a head-to-head conflict here. And for some reason, he didn't like me at all, which I can understand. A lot of people don't. But that's okay. But what bothered me about it was he kind of disliked God because of me. And that bothered me internally. The fact that I was in the seminary by that time, I wasn't attending yet, but I was on my way. And the fact that I was preaching in the church, somehow, and the fact that I was taking Carol away from him, he transferred that anger onto the Lord and said, you know, you're not giving me the girl of my dreams, you're not giving me this, you're not giving me that, you brought in this loser, and you're giving her to him, and what's going on here? So I think he got angry with God, given the circumstance. Well, that was in the late 80s, early 90s, 91, 92, if you remember, we had that horrific freeze. And the first freeze was terrible, but it killed all his fruit. It didn't kill the trees, but it killed all his fruit. And this added, I think, fuel to his anger. And he got even angrier at God and somehow blamed me for the freeze. That I'm the reason it froze and all his fruit was destroyed. I'm good, but I ain't that good. I'm going to bring a freeze. Well, 2 years later, in 94 or whatever it was, 93, it was either 91 and 93 or 92 and 94. I forget the years, but they were a year apart. An even worse freeze came. I don't know if you all remember that. In fact, it snowed here. And it not only snowed here, it snowed a lot here. And then overnight, of course, it dropped down to like 17 degrees for 12 hours or something like that. Well, that killed all his trees. I mean, that didn't just kill the fruit, that killed the trees. So now he's got 3 giant orange groves, and every tree in them was dead. Wow. I never saw Bobby Stokes after that again. I don't know if he ever set foot in another church. I don't know if he's still alive to this day. He's about my age, so he could be. But I got to wonder, how do you handle, if you're a Christian, how do you handle when things get tough? When people pick up rocks and stone you with them and drag you outside the city and leave you for dead, how do you handle stuff like that? When a freeze comes and kills all your fruit, and then the freeze comes and kills all your trees. All those, I do know for a fact that all those orange groves are gone, and there's of course developments on all of them now, condos and stuff like that, apartments. So he must have sold that property and, you know, took the money and got on with his life somewhere. But how do you deal with difficult situations when the world brings them against you? We already discussed the last chapter that even though you're with God, for every one person that would support you, 10 will not support you, will in fact hate you, and Jesus told us that. He said, look, the world hates me. So what do they think? What do you think is going to happen if you get out there and start talking about me?
They're going to hate you.
Well, those who are not interested are going to show you how much they're not interested. And sometimes that gets pretty rough. All you got to do is go online for 5 minutes and see some preacher trying to preach out in the streets and look at all the hundreds against him. And I know he's trying to do a good job, and I know these guys that do that are out there preaching the Lord anyway, and I admire them. That's not my style. I don't do that. I'd rather talk with people one-on-one or 2 or 3 on one, you know, rather than go into an angry crowd of 300 and try and talk about Jesus when they're not there to talk about Jesus. They're there to beat up ministers, you know, this kind of stuff. And God has given me the cowardice or the wisdom in that situation to run away. Not that I'm embarrassed for God or anything like that, but you know, nothing good is going to come of that. Really, in most cases. They're there because they want to kill you. You're there because you'd like to save them, but, you know, if they're not buying, I believe in the shake off the dust of your boots and live to argue another day. Maybe that's cowardice, maybe that's wisdom. I mean, you could go either way with that. Paul got beat up. Now, the good thing about this is Paul only got stoned once. You know, he tried it. He didn't like it, so he didn't let it happen again. And that's probably wisdom on that sense. How do you deal with this in terms of your Christianity? Well, Paul said, we've got to preach on. We got work to do, fellas. You know, this is just a minor setback. He's down here right now. It's just a minor setback. I'm okay. Let's get going. And then he goes right back into the same cities again. Now, that's the question of wisdom right there. Or is it, regardless of what happens, me and God make a majority in every situation? So he does go right back into these situations, and of course probably was run out and run out and run out. But the few people that he did talk to, the couple that did listen, and the you know, guy over here and the lady over here who did embrace Jesus, he went back for them. They were the good seed. And he went back for them. And he said, look, he strengthened their faith. And basically what he does a lot, he strengthens their faith and he says, it's going to be tough around here for you. You got to understand that. And he said the same thing to them probably that I'm saying to you. For every one person that says, good job, you're a Christian, there's going to be 10, 20 that are going to hate you for it. And know that. Don't go into this thing blind. Faith is going to cost you something. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote a wonderful, incredible book called The Cost of Discipleship. And he discusses, basically he argues, is this part of faith that you will suffer? And Jesus seemed to think it was. He said, they hated me, they're going to hate you. They're going to drag you before courts. They're going to drag you before kings. They're going to beat you up. They're going to chain you up. They're going to throw you in prison. They're going to do anything and everything they can to convince you this God stuff ain't worth it. Question: is it worth it? Is it worth it to you? Because I guarantee you're probably going to get hit on the head with something. Somebody's going to talk bad about your mother. Somebody's going to hit you, run over you with a car. Are you willing to deal with that? You know, nowhere did Jesus say, oh, once you believe in me, the world is fabulous. He said quite the opposite. This world is evil. It's been evil forever. It's run by the king of evil and all his minions. But God, he says, fear not, for God and I have overcome the world. We're bigger, we're stronger, and we're on your side. Well, what does that mean? Well, it obviously doesn't mean nothing's ever going to happen to you. Then we go back to that verse when Paul was converted. Ananias, go heal him. And Ananias said, Lord, I don't want him. You know, he's here to arrest me, to kill me. And God said, you don't worry about that. I will show Paul how much he will suffer for my name's sake. How do you translate that? How do you translate that? Well, sometimes the Lord lets the world do what the world does. And sometimes they do it to Christians. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's an unpleasant thing, for sure. But Paul later writes, you know, if we are children of God, like any other child, sometimes we have to discipline our children, correct? When you were growing up, did Roch ever get a spanking spoon and let you have it? Sure she did. She's got the anger of the island. Aye. Well, I'll get around to it in a while. That's the only saving grace there. Nobody owns a clock in the Dominican Republic. Nobody. I think they're a band or something. They're not allowed. So anyway, if you're going to have lunch promptly at 1, you'll probably be eating around 4:38.
Yeah.
They're better than the Southerners when they say, oh, we're fixing to eat. Well, the Southerners, that means like an hour or so. And the island people, it means like it could be tomorrow. We're fixing to eat. I hope you're not standing in line for anything. So anyway, stuff's going to happen. And you're fixing to be a Christian? Well, I got news for you. Some days it can go bad. Question becomes, is God worth it? That's the question. Is God worth it? And every parent will discipline their children. Why? Because they hate them? No. Because they love them. You're doing something stupid. It's going to get you in trouble someday. Or worse, it's going to hurt you. Or worse, it's going to kill you. Don't stick the fork in the electric socket. That's a bad thing to do. And you know, people are basically, and I've said this a million times in the Chanterisms, never underestimate the stupid in America. It's incredibly everywhere. You know, that fork, let's see what happens. And you know, that won't be enough. They'll do it a couple more times just to make sure. And you think to yourself, good Lord, that guy's stupid. Chanter's done the same thing a number of times. Well, let's see if this happens. Or, you know, Einstein called it insanity, didn't he? To do the same thing again and again, expecting a different result. That's insane. Stop doing it. Well, that's where most of us are in the Christian faith. I tried church. I asked God to heal my mom. He didn't heal my mom. I wanted to be part of the men's group, and they made fun of me. I baked a pie for the ladies' group, and nobody ate it because I hated it. So I'm not going back there. I'm never setting foot in that church again. The pastor made fun of me. Lord, if that were true, Brandy would have been gone years ago. I make fun of her about every week. That's because she sits right there. Don't ever sit in that pew. The point is, the question becomes focused on you, and that question is God worth it? I think Paul answered correctly. You know, Peter did too, so he thought. What did he say? He said, I'll never leave you. I'll go even to the death, right? And how did Jesus answer? No, you'll deny me 3 times before this night's over. Before this very night where you said, I will stand with you even to death. He said, no, you'll deny me 3 times before morning, before the sun rises. And what happened? He denied him 3 times, and we are told Peter went out and wept bitterly. He failed the exam. He failed the test. He lost the most precious thing he ever had as a dumb fisherman. He got to work and walk and live with the Son of God for 3 years, and he just denied him 3 times. Paul, on the other hand, got the snot beat out of him. And he asked the same question. Is this worth it? And he said, let's go, boys. We've got work to do. And he went right back to the same cities and sailed home and began to tell everybody his triumphant victory. I wonder if Paul talked about his beating he took. We don't have any evidence that he did. Later he would to Timothy. You know why? Because Timothy was getting ready to bail on God. He was in the island of Crete, over here somewhere. And things weren't going well. And Timothy said, you know, this just isn't what I want to do anymore. And he was getting ready to bail on God. And Paul wrote him a letter and said, you know what? You think you're some kind of sinner because you're bailing on God? Let me tell you about the chief of sinners. I used to kill people to please God. That was a bad idea. then I did this and I did that. And then we get that resume, Paul's resume, the only time he lets it go. He says, I was beaten 5 times with 39 lashes. That's what Jesus got once. 5 times for Paul. You know, you try something, you like it, you do it again. 5 times he was beaten. 3 times he was hit with metal rods. You all know what that's like, to bang your shin on something, right? And you go, oh, God, that hurt. How would you like it if they just stood you there and beat you with metal rods? And of course, once, he mentions it once and only once, I was even stoned and left for dead. But God saw to it that I would rise up again and preach on. Now, what Paul doesn't mention in his letter to Timothy is he tried to bail once too. After the second journey, you'll see that over here in this area when he's trying to establish the Thessalonican church and these over here. He just gets frustrated. He tries to go up into the Germanic tribes up this way and the Spirit won't let him. He tries to go over this way and the Spirit won't let him. You got to remember, historically, this is when all the Attila the Huns and that stuff and everything was up there. Very warlike. Nobody's talking Christianity. And the Spirit said, you're not going up there. Well, where am I going to go? He's in Ephesus when this happens. And the Lord said, come over to Mesopotamia and help these people. So that's what he does. He sails over here. And of course, he had great success over there with Thessalonica and Philippi and other churches. Okay? So, you got to be strong in that saying, Lord, this ain't going to deter me. I think you're worth it. But again, eventually, when things just get so frustrated, you have those days where you say, I quit. On average, ask Kurt Merricky this, on average, ministers quit once or twice a week. And the Lord says, do you really want to quit? Yes. No. Yes. Maybe. I think sometimes we just want people to say, hey! And that's it. That's all we got to say. You know, this job could be easier. Timothy says, I'm quitting, I'm bailing. And Paul writes that letter where he says, I was beaten. I was hit with rods. I was stoned and left for dead. But I'm going to tell you, through it all, God is still worth it. And I can't tell you that enough, and I can't prove it to you right now. But I got a strong feeling. And that would be just shortly before he would write, for me to live is Christ, for me to die is gain. So as I face the chopping block right now, don't worry about me. If I live on through this, it will be for your sakes, because I want you to know what I know or have come to know about the Lord. Well, this is his first lesson. They go, oh, that's his first missionary journey. No, that's his first lesson in what it means to be a child of God on this earth. This ain't an easy place to be. Not even in this modern day and age. Turn on your TV or your video and look, there's a guy out there preaching and people are throwing stuff at him and beating him up and shoving him out of the way. It's still nasty out there. But God's worth it. And he would write to Timothy and say, Timothy, preach on. And yet when Paul gets to Ephesus, he says, I've had it. The Lord says, you ain't even started to have it. I want you to go to Mesopotamia and start here. We've much to do, and you've got to do it. What happened? Paul went to Mesopotamia. Why did Paul go to Mesopotamia? Asks the interpretive question. Why? You're going to see this in the next chapter, by the way. Next 2 chapters. Why did Paul go to Mesopotamia? Because he answered that question. God's worth it. Is this worth it? He was stoned, he was bloodied, he was beat to snot, and they dragged him out of the city. And he must have been in really great shape because they left him for dead. And even his own disciples were standing around probably wondering, what are we going to do now? You know, the beauty of Peter is after the resurrection and Jesus was alive and they saw him alive and everybody said, yay. They said, what do we do now? Peter said, I'm going fishing. He was a fisherman, right? I'm going to go back to what I know and just, whoa, this God stuff's too much. And there on the lake that day was a little fire burning. And who was sitting there next to the fire? Jesus Christ. What are you doing?
Cooking dinner.
Why? What are you doing, Peter? Where are you? Oh, we're out fishing. Jesus said, did you catch anything? No, all night. He was a lousy fisherman. That's twice. He all night caught nothing. And he said, cast your net over to the side. And what happened? 153 fish caught. Numbered them. Boy, it's not like Peter hadn't seen that before. And he said, it's the Lord. You think? Peter wasn't the brightest bulb in the knife drawer. Or the sharpest bulb in the lamp. Or whatever that expression is. But the Lord dealt with him, and eventually he had to ask himself the question, is it worth it? And Peter turned and went back to Rome, where he was arrested and crucified. Paul's answering the same question right here. I would think getting stoned and left for dead would pretty much put that question in concrete. Is God worth it? Let's go, boys. We got work to do. He went back and strengthened the few disciples that he had, made sure they were in good shape before he sailed back for Antioch. He got back to Antioch and he's telling everybody, how did things go? Oh, they were fabulous. Should have seen the believers. We loved it. It was great. We don't hear any mention of that stoning thing or the beating thing. Not yet. It would be late when Paul's over here in Rome and worried about things, and he would write, yeah, I got beat up a little bit. But you know what? Through it all, for me to live is Christ. How could he say that? Well, because he learned firsthand God is worth it. No matter what. Chapter 14, the lesson has begun. It's going to get better. Okay? Remember, we're planting a church. We're planting the witness of God on this earth and in a region that's most unhospitable. This isn't the big cities. These are tiny little villages in a desertous mountain region. As opposed to Ephesus, who was a big seacoast city, lots of sailors, lots of groceries, lots of malls and stuff. And, well, they also had lots of gods too. In Ephesus was the great statue of Artemis that was supposedly 8 stories tall, solid gold, in a giant thing they carved out of the mountain there. And everybody worshipped Artemis. And Paul had to build a church there. Good luck with that. Anyway, we'll get to that later. That was one of the ancient wonders of the world, was the golden statue of Artemis, if you remember that. But unfortunately, I think somebody got their hands on it, probably Caesar or somebody, and melted it down to pay his soldiers. Okay, that's all I got. Go away.